Hello and welcome to this video. Today, actually, I want to talk to you about working with a client who basically very different circumstances to the last example I gave, where I talked about an example of working with someone who was very focused on changing specific habits. Now, in this example today, I want to talk to you about a client who signed up for a program, so how to stop overeating program. So she did want to change food habits, lots of them, and she wanted to change patterns of behavior, lose weight, but actually her start point was very different. So her start point was from a place of a lot of stress. So she was, and actually the food was the primary source of comfort, if you can understand that. So there was a lot of stress, a lot of change going on. She was very clearly overwhelmed when she signed up for this program. Now, as you're probably aware, when it comes to losing weight, obviously we need to change behaviours. If we're going to stand any chance of success in losing weight, it always involves change, because whatever we're doing now isn't working, basically. So when we're talking about changing behaviours and changing eating habits, then as you're probably also aware, is that can also be quite stressful. Adding a lot of change and variety to every single part of your day can really add to the overwhelm if you're already feeling overwhelmed. So I just want to talk about how I introduced a few tools for this client to actually do a lot of work up front before we even started talking about changes to diet or changes to habits. Because I think a lot of times people go into diets and change without starting at the right point. And it is so important that we're starting from the right place, because when we're overwhelmed and we're stressed, and then we take away that bit of comfort that we've got from food and we don't replace it with something else. So we're using things that, we're basically starving ourselves, and we've still got all the stress, and we're just adding to that, then we just create a lot more pain for ourselves. So in this example, when the client came and talked about everything that was going on, there was so much emotional charge in there. And I thought, if we start talking about changing habits, it just wasn't even feasible. What we had to do was get her to the point by using tools and by talking through. So a lot of this was coaching face to face. So, but what I can share with you is like the tools that she did in her own time. So we coached through some of the obstacles and challenges, but also some of this, we had to address some of the things that were operating behind the scenes, the mindset reasons about why she was feeling so much stress and overwhelmed. Because actually some people really seem to absorb the problems of others and carry them about. A lot of people that I've worked with tend to be very strong people, and they tend to be the people who everyone comes to with the problems. And sometimes they pick up these, like, they take the emotional charge almost, and they start to pick these problems up as they go along, and they don't necessarily have a way of releasing that. So they're there for everyone else, and they don't necessarily have someone that they turn to for support. And I think a lot of times that can get to a point where suddenly, like the example of this client, it just became too much. And where she's turning towards habits and overeating, when in fact what she needed to do was figure out a way to put down these problems instead of taking them on board herself and carrying them around. She had to find a way to put them down, basically, once people, her own, and manage negative emotions, not just her own, but those of other people as well. So it was kind of a bit of an educational process, really, about, okay, so we take a step back and we look at what's really happening, and we kind of, we start to then see that there's other ways that we can respond to negative emotions. So one of the first things we talked about was how we, it sounds a bit strange out of context, but one of the things that we do, one of the things our brain does, it puts more emphasis on the negative in life. And often we can be surrounded by positive things that we just take for granted. And that sounds a bit trite, but it actually does happen. So the unconscious mind will put 3 times more emphasis, for example, on negative stuff than it will do on positive stuff. And actually, if you imagine over time, if we don't consciously remind ourselves of the good stuff we have, then we can end up in this place where we think that everything around us is negative and is against us, or we can have this unbalanced view. So a really useful tool if you're in that stage where you're thinking everything is going wrong is just to do the 10-minute exercise that is part of this program. So within the 10-minute exercise, I'll explain it now, is a 5-minute meditation. Now you can download like an app these days. It's so easy to find lots of examples of meditation practices. But what meditation does is it teaches us to recognize when our brain is taking us down a path that we don't necessarily want to go down, or it's taking us down the old thought patterns. And it just teaches us to bring it back to something neutral or positive. And that is one of the most powerful things about meditation, is that we keep practicing moving our thoughts back to a neutral position, so we get less of this stress and constant noise that sometimes operates constantly behind the surface. And then if it's happening in a very negative and very critical way, day in, day out, then the more you can practice bringing it back to a central position where it just either focusing it on something basic, or it focusing it on something more positive, not necessarily fake positivity there, but something that genuinely you could be grateful for in life. Some of the things that you might have taken for granted. And that's what we did. It was just like really simple. It's the things that we overlook in life. Start to refocus and truly get like that enjoyment from them, and remind ourselves of some of the good things that we have. And like I say, out of context, it doesn't sound that powerful. But at the same time, if you're feeling that stress and overwhelmed, take a step back and just one thing that's really useful to do is like the thought download. So literally, when you're getting all that internal noise, just literally start to journal what's going on in your mind, because it seems so real when it's in our heads and when it's up there. It seems so real. But sometimes just that process of writing things down, we start to question really the truth and the thinking behind what's happening, because a lot of it sometimes is just noise, and a lot of it sometimes is just repeating thoughts from the past about where we've messed up or things haven't gone right, and thoughts about the future, about where things could go wrong. We don't need to focus on that all the time, whether things have gone wrong in the past or could do in the future. We don't need to be constantly thinking about it. You know, there's plenty of things in our past that have gone right. So perhaps if we take our minds to those examples more often, we can feel better in the moment than if we keep going back to these examples. So literally, when someone's firstly like a new client, and they come in with all these problems and these examples and what's going wrong and all this stress, when we sit down and look at it from a detached perspective and look at it from a different view and say, like, right now, what is the stress? What is so stressful? Sometimes that just uncovers that they've built things up just over time by thinking about them over and over again, if that makes sense. So what else did we try with them? So we tried the 10-minute meditation practice. So it's 5 minutes of meditation plus the gratitude. So literally every day writing down 3 things that you're genuinely grateful for in your life. Or I mean, if you can't think of 3, think of 1. You know, at least keep making those steps forward, because when we remind ourselves, we go into that state as well, that state of positive. And it's just literally, this isn't about pretending that there's no negative there. It's about making the balance more realistic instead of allowing our brains to put more emphasis on the negative, than because naturally it does that. So we're basically here talking about managing that balance and refocusing the mind on some of the good stuff. So we did that 10-minute experience, and that involves as well the visualization. So a lot of people that want to change habits literally start from that point that I'm here and I don't want to be here, and haven't got that clear positive view of where they want to go. And the power of visualization for helping motivate and reframe that sort of that place of overwhelm. So literally that's with this client, you know, who's overwhelmed, we just kind of shifted that focus to, well, where do you want to be? And keep shifting that focus to where do you want to be? Where do you want to go in terms of how you deal with problems, in terms of how you, you know, deal with emotions. So we cover all these elements so that instead of, you know, she could recognize that she's taking on this emotion, but she knows she, like, her mind can already think of different ways that she could do that. She says, well, when I say goodbye, I could get, you know, literally let them take the problems away with them. So there's the different ways of just literally changing your perspective on how you process things can be really effectual. So we had that. We did some reframes, and I'm just checking my notes because there was something else that I've forgotten. The thought downloads are really helpful in terms of questioning as well. So like I say, when it comes to, like, we talked about some of the most negative emotions, so it was like stress and overwhelm. And within this course, I've introduced you to what's called a self-coaching model. And this is so useful. So within the self-coaching model, it teaches us that basically the circumstances are basically the facts of life. These are the things that are happening around us. And it's actually it's how we think about the facts that has the impact on us. It's how we interpret things that actually then creates the good or the bad in our lives. So we just basically, sometimes it's so useful to separate out what are the facts of the problem and what are the thoughts that I'm having, and just literally separating them out is such a useful exercise to then be able to see in front of you in black and white what's really happening. Because, you know, we can get so involved in these problems and be in the thick of it, and when we step back, it's just like this light bulb moment goes off and you go, oh, actually, could that mean something else? Could this person's behavior mean something else? So we start to ask different questions about the situation, and that can really help resolve a situation without even changing the circumstances. Because quite often we can't change the circumstances, and we create all this stress and all this anxiety and all this overwhelm. And when we feel like that, that's often when we turn to the habits anyway. We turn to those comfort foods in order to process that negative emotion. But when we start to question our thinking and actually question the truth behind it, and ask those questions about, you know, could this person's behavior mean something else? So think about a time or an example in your own life where you're stressed or you're overwhelmed. And like literally, write down what are the facts about this situation, and then write down what you're thinking about the facts. So it could be, my brain's gone blank now. So think about an example, you know, a problematic relationship, for example, or somewhere where you're struggling. And you could say somebody's behaviours, what they do and what they say are the facts of a behaviour. So your partner says this and that and that, those are facts. And what we often try and do is change what they say or change their behaviours, instead of necessarily looking at how we interpret what they say, because we actually put meaning on that. And then when you write down what you're interpreting, you know, how many times are you mind reading? How many times are you assuming that they're meaning something that isn't actually necessarily true? So, and just by going through that and approaching it in a slightly different way, we can then just step out of that scenario where we're trying to control everything around us. We're trying to control what people say because we think we'll feel better. But actually, if we can question our own thinking and realize that it's not 100% true, we start to realize how much mind reading we might be doing. And we start to realize, well, if somebody says that, that's obviously their right to do that. Could I look at it a different way? Could I attach less meaning to that statement? Because it's only really when we have that power to attach meaning to something or not. We have the power to let something that somebody says to us affect us or not affect us. It's our responsibility to change our focus rather than to change other people's behaviours. So that's kind of hopefully a broad overview of some of the different kind of things we talked about in order to get to that point where we could then say, right, for this client, I feel in control. I know how to not take on board so much of this emotion. I know how to process emotions better by doing these thought downloads, questioning my thinking, and practicing this daily meditation so that I don't let my brain constantly run away onto the negative sides of what's negatively happening in my life, sort of either in the past or in the future. So once we start to get to that point, so we realize that we have much more control than we think. And it's when we realize that we have much more control and we start to practice using that control and practice using those choices that we can really, we're in the right place to then start to say, right, these are the habits that I now want to start to change, and I'm ready to face some of the discomfort that goes around changing habits. So hopefully I've not waffled on too much in this particular example. It's quite a complex example, to be honest, and a lot of things come down to effective questioning to a certain to a specific examples. But I think it's useful to say, well, actually, if you are feeling overwhelmed, then use the self-coaching model and really practice using that as a tool to question your thinking and how that's affecting your emotions, especially if it's around stress and overwhelm. And just consider, what you can separate out. If you can't control it and you're trying to control it, then that creates stress. So just being aware of what you can and can't control is a really useful step forward in the right direction, so that you can then step forward with that sort of positive vision of where you want to go. So thanks for joining me today. Hopefully that makes sense. And I will put a summary. I'll put a summary together with some examples of tools that we use, hopefully to just make that a little bit clearer. All right. Thanks for joining me. I'll do a couple more examples of case studies with more straightforward examples, I think, of what tools are useful for which particular scenario. All right. See you later.